everyone, EJ from iDesign.com here, and today I'm going to be showing you how to create 2D style ribbons in Cinema 4D. Now, you'll know if you work with After Effects much, it's very hard to create these 2D style ribbons with 3D depth to it. You know, the type of ribbons you'll see in a lot of infographics, web design, motion graphics stuff, right? And if you're like me, I just try to stay away from making any 3D kind of stuff in After Effects just because of there's no true 3D workspace in After Effects, and if I can do it in Cinema 4D, I'm gonna go ahead and do that. So that's what I'm gonna show you how to do is 2D ribbons in Cinema 4D that have a little illustrative style effect. So right now I have this nice little shield element with my Wacom pens because, as they say, the Wacom pen is mightier than the sword, right? So I'm going to go ahead and first I'm going to turn off the interactive render region here. You can see my ribbon spline that I made. And I'm going to skip the how to make a spline thing because I hope we all know how to make a spline at this point. So got this nice spline here. You can see how I made it in my front and top view here. You can make any style ribbon you want. But I like this nice wispy curvy one. So the first thing we need to do is actually get geometry on this ribbon spline here. So the first thing I'm going to go ahead and do is get some geometry. So I'm going to create a plane and I'm going to make this orientation to positive Z so it's standing upright, and I'm just going to move it up here in front of our little shield element, and I'm going to keep the width at 400, but the height I'm going to bring down all the way to like 40. So let's go ahead and we need to wrap this along the spline, so we're going to use the aptly named spline wrap deformer, and we'll just make this a child of our plane object so we can actually activate that or apply that deformer to the plane. And I'm going to define the ribbon spline as the spline we're going to use to deform our geometry. And you can see that, boom, there we go. We have our spline wrap deforming our plane, but it's really chunky right now. And the reason for that is because our width segments are very low. So if we bring this up, you can see that this is smoothing out our rib. And I'm going to go ahead and just jack it up to 200 just to be safe. And for height segments, I'm going to bring this down. We don't need 20 height segments, so I'm going to bring this down to, say, 2. Whoop. Let's hit F2 accidentally. Let's go back into our main view here and just hit 2. There we go. And the reason for this will be apparent later, and I'll get to that later, why I don't just choose 1. But I'm going to leave that at 2. So, okay. Got everything good. I'm going to go ahead and apply a ribbon texture, and I'm using a cell shader, and you can find out more about the cell shader in my recent tutorial on how to use the cell shader. And I'm going to apply that to the plane here. I'm going to render that, and you can see we have this nice 2D illustrative depth to our ribbon, but you'll see that the shading is flipped backwards, and the reason for that is because our UVs are a little bit flipped, and that's because of our orientation. So if we go to our plane and just switch it to -Z and hit render, there we go. Now we got the shadow on the right side. Everything's looking good. The one thing, I mean, you might like how this looks right now, where you have your this angled curves to your ribbon, but I want the angle of my curves to be straight up and down, so it looks a little bit more 2D-ish, right? So what I'm going to go ahead and do is my ribbon spline, I'm going to create an instance of that, okay? And so that's just going to make a copy of my ribbon. If I move this up, you can see that there's my second copy. And if I just undo that, so it's right where it originally got its instance from, original position. And I'm going to go ahead to my spline wrap, and you're going to see this rail option. Now what a rail spline does is help drive where your ribbon or your object is going to wrap along. So think of like train tracks, where if you have one train track, you can kind of go all crazy on the other one, but if you have two splines guiding everything. You can get really precise control of where you want your spline or where your geometry bends and everything like that. So right now it's just kind of arbitrary. And if I go to my rotation, you can see that, you know, it's just kind of rotating how it wants to along that spline. You can play around with the up vector and stuff. And if I put a 1 in the Y up vector, you can see that that kind of straightens out the front, but then the back, it's still kind of curved. So that's not working for us. So I'm going to go ahead and zero all that out. So what I'm going to do with this rail is use this ribbon spline instance. And I'm going to go ahead, and you can see it's all janky right now, but if I move this up, move our spline instance up in Y, you can see that flattens everything out. And that's because we're using the exact same spline as our spline instance, the exact same spline basically, only moved upwards to be our rail. So everything's going to be nice and flush, and our edges are going to be nice and flat in the Y. So if I render this, see, this looks really nice. We have this really nice 2D flat edges effect to our ribbons. And you might like that, you might not, but that's how you get the nice flat edges over here. So that rail helps flatten everything out and lets the ribbon flow more predictable along your original spline here. So cool. All right, so next what we're gonna do is add little ribbon tips here on the edges here. So the most important thing is to make sure we have fit spline and then extend. So what I'm going to do is we need to actually change this geometry to make our little ribbon points here. And what I'm going to go ahead and do is I'm going to go and first group our objects here, and we're going to name this null ribbon. And I'm going to pull out the spline wrap and just bring it in the same level of the hierarchy, because I'm going to apply a different deformer to my plane. And I'm going to go ahead and apply a correction deformer. And if you've never used a correction deformer, I'm going to turn off my spline wrap here. If I go to point mode, you can see that by placing a correction deformer on our plane, we now have access to all these points and all these edges and all these polygons, but we don't have our plane object made editable. So this correction deformer allows you to access and deform all of those points and everything without making that editable, which is awesome. So this is very helpful in certain situations. So for right now, we're going to go in here and I'm going to select the two corner points here, and you remember why I created two height segments here. If I just had one, you can see there's no middle section there, so this wouldn't work. So let me go back and bring up our height segments again. So select the two corners on each side. So we got all four corner points selected. And then we're just going to scale along the X here ever so slightly. And you can see that that's making our points here, our little ribbon tips. So if I turn the spline wrap back on, you can see that's it's pretty janky right now. So I'm going to bring this in, and I'm also going to go to my rotation from rail, and I'm going to turn that off. You can see that's going to straighten that out. So that's a very huge option there to just make sure you uncheck. So this just kind of continues on as if it's following this last point's direction or angle of its Bezier path to kind of infinity, right? Cool. So we have our spline tips with our correction deformer. And the nice thing about that is you can kind of change this to your heart's content because it's always there. We didn't make anything editable or anything like that. So the next thing we can do is go ahead and we can add some text. And I'm going to add text using a spline shader. Also got a tutorial on that as well. And we're going to learn some Latin. I'm going to render this out. And on this little shield element with my iDesign logo. It's Oculus Propositum. I took Latin in high school. Yes, I'm a dork, but this means basically I design in Latin. There you go. There's your Latin learning fulfillment of the day. Cool. So we got that. Let's add a seam to this ribbon as well. So let's create a new material. And I'm going to turn off color. I'm going to turn on luminance. And I'm just going to go ahead and grab this darker orange color here. Maybe make it just a tad bit darker. And that's going to be our seams color. Now I'm going to turn off our specular. To get our seams, our little seam lines that will kind of go along the top and the bottom here, I'm going to go into our alpha channel. I'm going to create a gradient. And I'm going to change this gradient from 2DU to 2DV, so we're up and down. And I'm going to change our interpolation to none. So I want just flat, no gradated, like smoothing between colors. And I'm just going to create some chiclets here to make a little seam there. And a little seam here in black and white. So we're using this black and white seam stuff as a mat, and we're going to kind of look at our position and see that these are kind of in the same place. So this is around 90, and let's see if that's 90, this should be like 10 or so. And then let's see, what is our white chiclet? So that's 88, so this will be 12. So now we have even positions on this gradient, and you can see that this is forming a little seam. And if I go to my picture viewer here, you see we have this darker seam using our color here. So I'm going to rename this seam, and I'm just going to apply this to our plane. Now let's render that. And now you can see we have this nice seam here. And if that's too dark, we can just go lighten that up a little bit. And if we want to change the thickness of that or even the position, we can move the seam points, a little chiclet on the gradients, a little more wide. And I can render that again. And there you go. We have this nice seam element here, right? Cool. So now we're basically done, but we can go ahead and animate this. We can animate the ribbons. So we're going to go ahead and go into our spline wrap, and we are going to have this as our endpoint, and we're just going to keyframe our to and from. And we're going to make this start from the middle here. So our our from is going to start at 50% as well as our to, and you can see that that now makes our ribbon disappear. Right? So if I go ahead in my timeline, you can see that we now have our ribbon unfurling as our from and to keyframes go from their respective 50% to 0 and 100. And we can go to our timeline and adjust the curve so they're a little bit faster from the get-go. And let's do a preview here. Let's just do the 45. All right, let's check this out. So there we have our ribbon forming. And for just some added, one thing I like to do, especially with ribbons, is slightly keyframe the strength here. So if I go to frame 45, hit a keyframe on strength and go to 0, and I'm going to bring the strength down to say 80, and we have to adjust our from and to here. And we'll probably have to add a display tag and keyframe that visibility. So let's turn that down to 0. Alright, so now with that strength, we have our stuff on our ribbon unfurling, and we also have our strength animating as well. So you can see that the strength animating kind of give this nice organic look, and you can really see it if I bring down the strength a whole lot more. So you can even keyframe it from this point to say, like, 40%, and we also need to go ahead and adjust these guys here. So maybe you can only get away with getting the strength so low before you have to kind of really mess around with all this stuff, and maybe even play with the size. But you get the point that adding that strength element kind of gives you a nice organic effect here. So that's my little workflow on how to create a 2D style ribbon in Cinema 4D, and animating it with a spline wrap and getting your correction deformer to create the little ribbon tips at the end, creating a seam, and using an instance of a spline to add to your rail to make your ribbon edges nice and flat. So that is it for today. And again, if you want to check out how to create this cell shader type look, or this nice illustrative type look, check out my cell shader tutorials, and also check out the spline shader tutorial on how to get that nice oculos propositum text as a material using the spline shader. As always, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.